The German panzer crew stood in stunned silence, circling the abandoned American tank destroyer like predators examining unfamiliar prey. It was March 26, 1945, in the dense forests east of the Rhine River, and Oberfeldwebel Klaus Becker couldn't reconcile what his eyes were telling him with everything he'd been taught about armoured warfare. The vehicle before him, an M18 Hellcat, violated every principle of German tank design. Its armour was laughably thin, perhaps 3/4 of an inch at the front, 1/2 an inch on the sides. The turret sat open to the sky, offering no protection from indirect fire, grenades, or even determined rifle shots from elevated positions. It weighed barely 18 tons, less than half the mass of his beloved Panzer IV. And yet, mounted atop this seemingly fragile chassis was a 76mm gun, the same weapon that had been punching through German armour with disturbing regularity since Normandy. Becker ran his gloved hand along the turret's edge, feeling the thinness of the steel. His loader, a young Gefreiter named Hans Weber, shook his head slowly. "This is suicide," Weber muttered. "The Americans sent their crews into battle in this?" But they had, and somehow these flimsy machines had been destroying German tanks at a rate that defied logic. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Over the next 72 hours, before Becker's unit would be forced to abandon the captured Hellcat during yet another retreat westward, this crew of German veterans would discover something that challenged the very foundation of their military doctrine. What they learned inside that American tank destroyer would reveal not just a difference in engineering philosophy, but two entirely different ways of thinking about warfare itself. One nation had built its tanks to stand and fight. The other had built them to hunt and vanish, and by March of 1945, it was becoming painfully clear which philosophy was winning. To understand Klaus Becker's shock at the Hellcat's design, you must first understand the world he came from, a world where armour was synonymous with survival, where thickness of steel plate was a measure of engineering excellence, and where the very concept of protection had become almost religious in its importance. Becker had joined the Panzerwaffe in the autumn of 1941, trained at the prestigious armoured warfare school in Winsdorf, south of Berlin. The doctrine drilled into every recruit was clear and unwavering. Armour protects, armour endures, armour wins. A tank that couldn't shield its crew from enemy fire was nothing more than a mobile coffin. The German engineering philosophy held that you built protection first, then added mobility and firepower around that protective shell. Everything else was secondary. This wasn't mere theory. It was born from harsh experience on the Eastern Front, where German crews had encountered the Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks in the summer of 1941. The shock had been profound. German 37mm anti-tank guns bounced shells harmlessly off sloped Soviet armour. Panzer III and IV crews watched in horror as their rounds failed to penetrate. The psychological impact of facing an enemy tank that your weapons couldn't hurt was devastating. Men broke. Units retreated. The myth of German invincibility shattered against those sloped steel plates. The response was predictably German. Build something bigger, heavier, more impenetrable. The Panther tank, Germany's answer to the T-34, weighed 45 tons. Its frontal armour was 3 inches thick, sloped at 55 degrees to maximize deflection. The Tiger I, introduced in late 1942, weighed 54 tons and boasted frontal armour nearly 4 inches thick. And the King Tiger, the ultimate expression of this philosophy, tipped the scales at a staggering 68 tons, with armour up to 7 inches thick on the turret front. These weren't merely tanks. They were fortresses that moved, or tried to move. Becker had commanded a Panzer IV throughout 1943 and most of 1944, first on the Eastern Front, later in France, after the Normandy invasion. He'd survived the massive tank battle at Kursk in July of 1943, where nearly 3,000 German and Soviet armoured vehicles clashed in the largest tank engagement in history. He'd seen Soviet 76mm shells bounce off German glacis plates. He'd watched from a distance as 88mm guns turned T-34 seconds into flaming wrecks from over a kilometre away. The weight of all that armour, the thickness of it, the sheer mass it gave you confidence. When you buttoned up inside a Panther, sealed the hatches, and heard the reassuring thickness of steel around you, you felt invulnerable, protected, safe. At least, that's what they told themselves. The reality, by early 1945, was devastatingly different. Germany's heavy tanks had become mechanical nightmares. The King Tiger's final drive and transmission failed with such regularity that maintenance crews developed a grim joke. You needed 2 King Tigers for every operation, one to drive into battle, one to cannibalize for parts when the first inevitably broke down. The Panther's engine caught fire so frequently that crews carried extra fire extinguishers as standard equipment. Fuel consumption was catastrophic. A Panther managed roughly 300 meters per gallon on good roads, significantly worse cross-country. A King Tiger consumed its entire fuel supply in under 60 miles of road travel. And the weight. The terrible, crippling weight. Bridges collapsed under King Tigers, roads disintegrated beneath their treads. Soft ground became impassable quagmires. Recovery of a disabled heavy tank required multiple recovery vehicles, dozens of men, and hours of precious time the Wehrmacht no longer had. Becker had personally lost 3 tanks during the retreat through France in August and September of 1944, not to enemy fire, but to mechanical failure. Running gear breaking down, transmissions seizing, engines overheating and catching fire. Each time, they'd been forced to destroy their own vehicle with demolition charges to prevent capture. Each time, Becker had watched Panther after Panther abandoned on roadsides, out of fuel, out of spare parts, out of time. But still, the doctrine persisted. Armour protects. Build it thicker. Make it heavier. Protection first. The Americans, Becker had been told through years of Wehrmacht propaganda, built cheap tanks, mass-produced garbage churned out by their industrial machine with no regard for quality or crew protection. The Sherman was a death trap, undergunned and under-armoured, prone to catastrophic fires when penetrated. German crews had derisive nicknames, Tommy Cookers or Ronsons, after the American cigarette lighter company whose advertising slogan was "Lights first time, every time." The propaganda films showed confident Panzer crews destroying Sherman after Sherman. One Panther could take out 5 Shermans, the newsreels proclaimed. One Tiger could stop an entire American armoured column. What they didn't tell Becker, what they couldn't tell him without admitting the war was lost, was that the Americans didn't care about one-on-one fights. They had 5 Shermans. And when those were destroyed, they had 5 more. And behind those, 5 more again. And overhead, hundreds of fighter bombers. And beyond visual range, thousands of artillery pieces. And in the supply depots, mountains of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The Americans had industrialized warfare itself. They'd looked at tank combat and asked a different question than the Germans. Not, how do we build the best tank, but rather, how do we build enough good enough tanks to overwhelm any opposition? And then, sometime in 1943, American designers had asked another question entirely. What if we stopped trying to slug it out with German heavy tanks? What if, instead of building something that could survive a hit from an 88mm gun, we built something fast enough that it never got hit in the first place? The answer to that question was the M18 Hellcat, and it was about to teach Klaus Becker that everything he believed about tank warfare was obsolete. The M18 had been abandoned hastily. Becker could see where the American crew had bailed out scuff marks on the hull, personal items scattered inside the turret. A pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes lay on the gunner's seat. A Stars and Stripes newspaper, dated March 23rd, was crumpled near the loader's position. Whatever had caused them to abandon the vehicle, they'd left in a hurry but without the desperation that suggested enemy fire. Mechanical breakdown, perhaps, or simply running out of fuel during the rapid American advance. Becker's crew gathered around the Hellcat with the mixture of curiosity and contempt that German soldiers reserved for captured American equipment. Oberleutnant Steiner, the unit commander who'd arrived to inspect the prize, walked a complete circle around the vehicle before speaking. "Pathetic," he said finally. "Look at this armor. You could punch through it with a Panzerfaust at 500 meters. Probably with a strong kick, Herr Oberleutnant," Weber added, and several men laughed. But Becker wasn't laughing. He was studying the Hellcat with the eye of someone who'd spent 4 years fighting in tanks. The thin armor bothered him less than it should have. There was something deliberate about this design, something intentional. The Americans weren't stupid. They'd built the Sherman with thicker armor. They'd built the M10 tank destroyer, which was essentially a Sherman chassis with a 3-inch gun. They knew how to add protection. So why hadn't they, here? "Weber," Becker said quietly. "Can you get it started?" The young loader looked surprised. "Herr Oberfeldwebel, we're taking it with us?" "No, but I want to understand it before we destroy it." Weber climbed into the driver's position while Becker hauled himself up onto the turret and dropped inside. The interior was shockingly spacious compared to a German tank. The open top meant no claustrophobic feeling of being entombed in steel. Visibility was extraordinary. The commander could see in all directions without relying on periscopes or vision blocks. Of course, that same openness meant vulnerability, but Becker was beginning to suspect the Americans had considered that trade-off and chosen visibility over protection for a reason. The engine was a Continental R-975, a radial aircraft engine adapted for armoured vehicle use. 9 cylinders arranged in a circle, producing 400 horsepower. Weber, who'd worked in his father's automobile repair shop before the war, had it started within 2 minutes. The engine note was different from any German tank Becker had heard, higher-pitched, more aggressive, almost eager-sounding. A Maybach engine rumbled. This Continental snarled. "Take us forward," Becker ordered. Slowly, through the trees. Weber engaged the transmission, and immediately Becker felt something different. The M18 seemed to float over the forest floor. Where a Panzer IV would grind and strain over uneven ground, where you'd feel every rock and depression transmitted through the hull, the Hellcat's torsion bar suspension absorbed everything. They were moving at 15 kilometers per hour, barely above idle speed, and the ride was smoother than a Kugelwagen on pavement. "The steering, Herr Oberfeldwebel," Weber called back, and there was wonder in his voice. "The steering, it's like driving my father's Opel." German tanks used clutch and brake steering, a brutal system where you literally stopped one track to turn the vehicle. It required significant physical strength and considerable skill, especially in the heavy tanks. Tiger drivers were selected partly for their upper body strength, because wrestling that massive vehicle through turns was physically exhausting. Becker had seen Tiger drivers emerge from their hatches after a day of combat with their arms shaking from exertion. The Hellcat had a steering wheel, an actual automobile-style steering wheel. Torque converters and a hydromatic automatic transmission allowed the driver to steer like a civilian car. Weber turned them in a tight circle, weaving between trees that would have required multiple point turns in a Panzer IV, and the Hellcat responded instantly. Smoothly, and Weber was smiling something Becker hadn't seen from any German tanker in months. "Take us to the road," Becker said. His voice was carefully neutral, but his mind was racing. "I want to see what this machine can actually do." They emerged from the forest onto an empty stretch of rural highway. The road headed east, back toward German lines, clear for at least 2 kilometers before disappearing over a gentle rise. No traffic, no aircraft visible, just open roads. Becker made his decision quickly. "Full throttle," he ordered. "Show me its maximum speed." What happened next was, in Weber's words, recorded decades later in a 1978 interview, completely and utterly insane. The M18 Hellcat accelerated like nothing Becker had ever experienced in 4 years of armoured warfare. The speedometer needle climbed with shocking rapidity. 30 kilometers per hour, 40, 50, 60, 70. The trees became a green blur. The wind roared over the open turret with enough force that Becker had to grip the turret ring to keep from being thrown around. His breath caught in his chest. 80 kilometers per hour. 85. 90. Weber was no longer merely smiling. He was laughing a wild, disbelieving sound that mixed exhilaration with something close to terror. They'd crossed a full kilometer in less than 45 seconds. A Panther's top speed, on a perfect road with a tailwind and fresh engine, was maybe 45 kilometers per hour in practice. The Tiger I, despite propaganda claims of 45 kilometers per hour, topped out at 38 in actual field conditions. The King Tiger managed 35 kilometers per hour on roads, less than 20 cross-country. The Hellcat was doing 90 kilometers per hour, 55 miles per hour, with a 76mm gun mounted on top. Becker's mind was working faster than the tank was moving, and that was saying something. Everything he'd been taught was wrong. Or rather, and this was more disturbing, the Americans had asked a completely different question. They hadn't asked, how do we protect the tank from being hit? They'd asked, how do we avoid being hit in the first place? The answer was speed. Terrifying, impossible, doctrine-shattering speed. Brake, Becker shouted over the wind, and Weber complied. The M18's hydraulic brakes brought them to a stop in a distance that would have been physically impossible for any German tank. No locked tracks, no skidding sideways, no controlled slide, just smooth, controlled, automobile-like deceleration. Becker climbed out of the turret and dropped to the ground. His legs were shaking slightly, though whether from the vibration of the high-speed run or from the implications of what he'd just experienced, he couldn't say. He walked around the Hellcat slowly, seeing it with entirely new eyes. The thin armor wasn't a weakness, it was intentional. Every single millimeter of armor plating they didn't add was weight they saved for speed. The open turret wasn't a design flaw or a cost-cutting measure, it was a calculated choice. Better visibility for the commander. The faster crew escaped if the vehicle was hit, lower weight for higher speed. And the suspension, the engine, the transmission, the steering system. Everything was designed for a single, unified purpose. Get into position, fire, and disappear before the enemy could react. The Americans had built a tank destroyer that didn't destroy tanks through superior armor or firepower. It destroyed them through mobility, through being where the enemy didn't expect, through hitting from angles that German tank designers had never seriously considered defending. The Americans called it the Hellcat for a reason. It hunted like a cat, fast, aggressive, opportunistic, and gone before you knew what had killed you. Becker ordered his crew to conduct a thorough examination of the captured Hellcat. What they discovered over the next several hours was a masterclass in American industrial design philosophy, a philosophy so fundamentally different from German engineering doctrine that it bordered on the incomprehensible. Weber, with his mechanical background, focused on the engine and transmission. The Continental R-975 was essentially a commercial aircraft engine, mass-produced and standardized across multiple vehicle types. It's the same engine they use in some of their light tanks, Weber reported. Probably even in aircraft trainers, everything is standardized, interchangeable. This was alien to German thinking. German engines were bespoke creations, each designed specifically for its vehicle. The Maybach HL-230 that powered the Panther was unique to that tank. The Maybach HL-230P45 in the Tiger II was a variant specific to that vehicle. If you needed a replacement engine, you needed the exact right engine. The Americans had apparently decided that good enough was better than perfect, as long as you could replace it quickly. The transmission was even more revealing. The hydromatic automatic transmission was, Weber discovered, based on a commercial automotive transmission used in civilian Oldsmobile and Cadillac automobiles before the war. The Americans had taken a proven civilian design, reinforced it slightly, and installed it in a tank destroyer. The result was a transmission that any mechanic familiar with American cars could service and repair. German tank transmissions were precision-engineered nightmares. The Maybach-Olvar transmission in the Panther required specialized training to maintain. The Tiger's transmission was so complex that field repairs were nearly impossible. When they broke, and they broke frequently, you needed a factory-trained technician and often had to remove the entire transmission from the vehicle. The American approach was simpler. If it breaks, any decent mechanic can fix it. If it breaks badly, throw it away and install a new one. They had plenty. But it was the gun that fascinated Becker most. The 76mm M1A1 was the same weapon mounted on the later model Sherman tanks, the ones German crews had learned to respect. Becker examined the gun's mounting, the traverse mechanism, and the elevation controls. Everything was hydraulically assisted. The turret could rotate a full 360 degrees in under 20 seconds. A Panther's turret took nearly a full minute to traverse completely, and that was with hydraulic assistance. A Tiger 1, with its manual traverse, could take over 2 minutes if the vehicle wasn't level. 20 seconds. The Hellcat could put its gun on target faster than most German tanks could even identify the threat direction. The ammunition stowage revealed another American advantage. The M18 carried 45 rounds of 76mm ammunition, stored in racks around the turret basket and in the hull. The rounds themselves were fascinating, armor-piercing, capped, high-explosive, and even new high-velocity armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds that Weber found in a partially empty rack. These HVAP rounds, Becker knew from intelligence briefings, could penetrate German armor that standard 76mm rounds couldn't touch. "How much does one of these shells weigh?" Oberleutnant Steiner asked, watching Becker examine the ammunition. "About 15 pounds, Becker replied. "Half what our 88mm rounds weigh." "Which means their loader can work twice as fast," Steiner said quietly. He was beginning to understand too. The pieces were fitting together into a disturbing picture. Fast vehicle, fast turret traverse, light ammunition allows rapid loading. The Americans had optimized every single element for speed of engagement. They weren't trying to win through superior protection or even superior firepower. They were trying to win through superior tempo. Get there first, shoot first, leave before the enemy can respond. It was guerrilla warfare in a tank destroyer. To understand why the M18 Hellcat's design philosophy was so shocking to German tankers, you have to understand the intellectual and institutional framework within which German armoured doctrine had evolved. This wasn't merely a matter of engineering preferences. It was rooted in military theory, national character, and the harsh lessons of the First World War. German military thinking in the interwar period was dominated by concepts of decisive battle and breakthrough. The tank wasn't conceived primarily as a mobile gun platform, but as an armoured fist that could punch through enemy lines, restore manoeuvre to warfare, and avoid the static bloodbaths of trench warfare. This required tanks that could absorb punishment, maintain formation, and continue advancing even under heavy fire. The tank was a battering ram, not a rapier. When German designers sat down to create armoured vehicles in the 1930s, they started from this doctrinal foundation. The tank must survive long enough to achieve breakthrough. Everything else followed from that requirement. Armour thickness became a primary consideration. Mechanical reliability was essential because a broken-down tank disrupted formation and tempo. Gun power was important, but mainly in the context of suppressing enemy positions and destroying obstacles, not necessarily killing other tanks. The shock of encountering the T-34 inches 1941 reinforced every instinct toward heavier armour. German tank crews reported a psychological phenomenon that became known as T-34 panic, the helpless feeling of being under fire from an enemy you couldn't hurt. Veterans of those early Eastern Front battles described firing round after round at Soviet tanks and watching the shells bounce off. Some crews broke entirely, abandoning their vehicles and fleeing. Others fought to the death against an enemy they couldn't kill, because doctrine demanded they hold position. The institutional response was predictable. Build tanks the enemy can't hurt either. Match their armor, exceed their armor, make German tanks invulnerable again. This led directly to the Panther and Tiger programs, both of which prioritized protection and firepower over mobility. The weight spiraled upward, but that was acceptable because the doctrine said breakthrough required survivability. By 1944, this doctrine had calcified into dogma. German tank designers couldn't conceive of deliberately reducing armor. It would be like a medieval armorer suggesting knights go into battle without chainmail. The armor was the point. A tank without adequate armor wasn't a tank, it was a target. The Americans, coming from an entirely different military and industrial culture, had never accepted these assumptions. American tank destroyer doctrine emerged from interwar theorists who'd studied the Spanish Civil War and the early years of World War II. They'd observed that static anti-tank guns, no matter how powerful, were vulnerable to flanking maneuvers, artillery, and air attack. What was needed was mobile anti-tank firepower that could rapidly concentrate at threatened points, engage enemy armor, and then relocate before counter-battery fire or enemy maneuver could neutralize them. The concept was called fire brigade tactics. Tank destroyer battalions would be held in reserve, rushed to wherever enemy armor broke through, engage at favorable range and angles, and then withdraw. They weren't meant to hold ground or slug it out in sustained combat. They were meant to ambush, destroy, and vanish. This doctrine required completely different vehicle characteristics. Protection was less important because you weren't supposed to get hit. If the enemy was shooting at you, you'd already failed. You should have destroyed them and left. Speed was paramount because you needed to reach threatened sectors before the enemy breakthrough achieved operational depth. Gunpower was critical because you might only get one shot before relocating. The M18 Hellcat was the purest expression of this doctrine. It was designed from the ground up to be the fastest tracked armored vehicle in the American arsenal. Weight was the enemy of speed, so armor was minimized. The Continental R-975 engine, already proven in the M3 and M5 Stuart light tanks, provided adequate power. The hydromatic transmission, borrowed from civilian automotive design, allowed rapid acceleration and high road speeds. The open turret reduced weight and improved crew visibility for spotting targets and threats. Everything that German doctrine said was essential armor protection. Enclosed fighting compartment, overwhelming firepower, was deliberately sacrificed for mobility. The Hellcat's designers had calculated that it was better to avoid 95% of enemy fire through speed and then absorb the remaining 5% as casualties than to slow the vehicle down with armor that might stop. 50% of hits, but guaranteed you'd be hit more often. It was a fundamentally different calculation of acceptable risk, and it worked because the Americans had the industrial capacity to replace losses and the training infrastructure to replace crews. A destroyed Hellcat could be rebuilt in days. A trained crew could be replaced within weeks. The Germans, by 1945, could do neither. On the second day of examining the captured Hellcat, Becker's unit received new orders. They were to pull back another 30 kilometers to establish a new defensive line. The Americans were advancing faster than German forces could retreat in good order. Fuel was desperately short. Food was becoming scarce. And morale, never openly discussed but visible in every man's eyes, was crumbling. "We can't take the Hellcat with us," Oberleutnant Steiner said, stating the obvious. "We don't have fuel to spare, and it would just slow us down." "I know," Becker replied, "but I want to test something first. I want to see how it performs in a defensive position." Steiner looked at him curiously. "What are you thinking?" "Hull down, sir. American doctrine. I want to see if it actually works." They spent the morning positioning the Hellcat in a perfect hull-down defensive position at the edge of a small ridge overlooking the road. Hull down meant that only the turret was visible to an enemy approaching from the front, with the hull protected by the terrain. It was a classic defensive technique, but one that required very specific terrain and careful positioning. The Hellcat, with its low profile and open turret, was ideal for this. German tanks, with their taller silhouettes, were harder to conceal effectively. The King Tiger, in particular, was so tall that finding hull-down positions for it was nearly impossible. Becker positioned himself in the commander's position, sighting down the road with the Hellcat's gun. From this position, he could see nearly 800 meters of approach road. Any vehicle coming from the west would be visible for at least 30 seconds before reaching effective range for return. Fire, assuming the enemy even spotted the Hellcat, which would be difficult with only the turret visible against the tree-line background. If this were a real ambush, Becker said aloud, we could destroy 2, maybe 3 vehicles before they even knew where the fire was coming from. And then you accelerate backwards down the reverse slope, traverse the turret to maintain aim, fire 2 more shots while withdrawing, and then race to your next position before enemy artillery can range you. Weber finished. He'd been studying the American tactical manual they'd found in the Hellcat. That's their doctrine. Shoot and scoot. Never stay in one place long enough for the enemy to fix your position. Steiner was nodding slowly. It's not how we fight. No, sir. It's not. But it's how you fight when you don't have enough tanks to lose. Steiner continued, when every vehicle is precious and every crew is irreplaceable. He paused, looking at the Hellcat. Except the Americans do have enough tanks. They have more tanks than we have ammunition to destroy them. So why do they fight this way? The question hung in the air. Becker thought about it carefully before answering. Because they can afford to, sir. They can afford to build a tank destroyer with thin armor because they have so many of them that losing one doesn't matter. They can afford to train crews in aggressive tactics because they can replace casualties. And they can afford to prioritize speed because they have the fuel to run these engines at full power. While we, Steiner said quietly, are running our magnificent Panthers and Tigers on fumes, abandoning them by the roadside because we can't even afford the diesel to move them. It was a dangerous thing to say, even in March of 1945, even among a small group of veterans who all knew the war was lost. Defeatism was still punishable by death if the wrong person heard you, but they were too tired to care, and the truth was too obvious to ignore. The Americans had industrialized warfare to such a degree that they could afford to build inferior weapons that were actually superior because they existed in such overwhelming numbers. They could lose 10 Shermans for every Panther and still come out ahead because they had 50 more Shermans in reserve. They could build Hellcats with thin armor because they were fast enough that it didn't matter, and if one got destroyed, 3 more would arrive tomorrow. Germany had built masterpieces. The Americans had built enough. On the 3rd day, they prepared to destroy the Hellcat. Standard procedure was to drop a grenade down the barrel to burst the gun tube, then place demolition charges around the engine and in the turret. But before they did, Becker asked for permission to make one final test. I want to race it against a Panzer IV, he said. Steiner raised an eyebrow. Why? Because I need to know, sir. I need to see the difference with my own eyes, measured, documented. If we survive this war, and that's a significant if someone should know what we learned here. They set up a straight course, 1 kilometer long, on a stretch of rural road. A Panzer IV from another unit was volunteered, with its commander happy to prove German superiority. The test was simple. Both vehicles start from a standstill, accelerate to maximum speed, complete the kilometer, and time each run. The Panzer IV went first. It was a late model OSF J, the final production variant, with a top speed of 40 kilometers per hour. The driver was skilled, the engine in good condition. They completed the kilometer in exactly 98 seconds. Then Weber took the Hellcat. Becker stood beside the road with a stopwatch. 54 seconds. The difference wasn't incremental. It wasn't a modest improvement. The Hellcat covered the same distance in almost exactly half the time. It was, as Weber said later, like racing a bicycle against a motorcycle. But Becker wanted one more test. "Reverse slope withdrawal," he ordered. "You're in an ambush position. You fire 3 shots, and then you need to retreat to a secondary position 1 kilometer back. How fast can you do it?" For the Panzer IV, this required stopping, having the entire crew dismount to act as guides because the driver couldn't see behind him, slowly backing down the slope in reverse gear. German tanks had terrible reverse speeds, turning around in a clearing, and then advancing to the secondary position. Total time, 11 minutes, 43 seconds. The Hellcat, with its better visibility, faster reverse speed, and superior mobility, completed the same maneuver in 4 minutes, 18 seconds. "Do you understand what this means?" Becker asked Steiner. "In the time it takes one Panzer IV to withdraw and reposition, a Hellcat can conduct 2.5 complete ambush cycles. Fire, withdraw, reposition, fire again, withdraw, reposition again, and be ready for a third engagement. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this." Steiner was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "We've been fighting the wrong kind of war with the wrong kind of tanks. We've been fighting the only war we could afford to fight with the only tanks we could build. The Americans are fighting a different war, a war of abundance. A war where losing is acceptable as long as you can replace your losses faster than the enemy. We were never going to win that war." That afternoon, they destroyed the Hellcat. Grenades in the barrel, demolition charges in the engine compartment. They moved out at dusk, continuing their retreat eastward, abandoning the burning wreckage behind them. But Becker carried the lessons with him. In the remaining weeks of the war, as his unit disintegrated around him, as they abandoned vehicle after vehicle for lack of fuel, as the Americans advanced with what seemed like infinite resources, he kept thinking about that Hellcat, about the philosophy it represented, about the sheer confidence required to build a tank destroyer with thin armor, trusting that speed and mobility would protect it. The Germans had built tanks for soldiers who expected to be hit and needed to survive. The Americans had built tanks for soldiers who expected to hit first and not be there when the enemy fired back. One philosophy was rooted in defensive thinking, in the expectation of being under attack, in the need to withstand punishment. The other was rooted in offensive thinking, in the expectation of dominating the tempo of combat, in the confidence that you could always escape. By March of 1945, it was clear which philosophy had won. Klaus Becker surrendered to American forces on May 4, 1945, 4 days before the formal German capitulation. His unit had disintegrated entirely in the final weeks. They'd abandoned their last 2 operational tanks, both Panzer IVs, near the Elbe River when they ran out of fuel. The crews scattered, some attempting to reach their homes, others simply walking west toward the American lines, because the alternative was captured by the Soviets, and everyone knew what that meant. Becker chose to surrender deliberately. He was 28 years old, exhausted beyond measure, and done with ideology. The war was over. Germany had lost. These were simply facts, as undeniable as the sunrise. He walked into an American checkpoint outside Magdeburg with his hands raised and his Soldbuch, his military identification booklet, held out before him. The American MPs processed him efficiently. They fed him better food than he'd seen in months. They asked questions through an interpreter about his unit, his movements, what forces remained operational in his sector. Becker answered honestly. There was nothing left to protect, no military secrets that mattered anymore. Germany was beaten. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. What surprised Becker, what he would remember for the rest of his life, was the casualness of the American soldiers. They weren't triumphant or cruel. They were just tired men doing a job, processing yet another batch of surrendered Germans with the same bored efficiency they might show processing paperwork. They had won the war, but they didn't seem to feel the need to prove it. Victory was so total, so obvious, that they could afford to be indifferent. It was that indifference, more than anything else, that drove home the scale of Germany's defeat. During his processing, Becker was held in a temporary POW cage with several hundred other captured Wehrmacht soldiers. They compared stories, pieced together what had happened in the final weeks, and tried to understand how completely their army had collapsed. And the stories all had similar themes: lack of fuel, lack of ammunition, lack of spare parts, lack of food, lack of everything except orders to fight to the last man. One Panzer lieutenant from a Tiger battalion told a story that stuck with Becker. His unit had received brand new Tiger IIs in late March, magnificent machines, perfectly engineered, with armour that could stop anything the Allies could shoot at them. But they'd received 5 Tigers and fuel for only 2. The other 3 had been pushed into a ravine and destroyed with demolition charges because there was literally no fuel to move them. They'd never fired a shot, never engaged an enemy, never justified the thousands of man-hours of skilled labour that had gone into building them. "We built masterpieces," the lieutenant said, echoing Becker's earlier conversation with Steiner, "and then we couldn't afford to use them." Another veteran, a Panther crew commander from Panzer Lehr Division, described the final American offensive. "They came at us with Shermans, Hellcats, their tank destroyers, infantry, aircraft, everything at once. We'd destroy 3, 4 vehicles, and 10 more would appear. We'd hold a position for an hour, run out of ammunition, and have to withdraw. They had unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, unlimited everything. The Hellcats were the worst," another man added. "You'd see them, take aim, and they'd be gone before you could fire. They'd hit you from a different angle. You'd traverse to engage them, and they'd already displaced. It was like fighting ghosts." Becker listened to these stories and realized they all pointed to the same conclusion. Germany had lost the war not because German equipment was inferior in many ways. It was superior, but because superiority didn't matter when the enemy had 20 times as many weapons. The Wehrmacht had brought swords to a gunfight, except the swords were exquisitely crafted, beautifully balanced, forged from the finest steel. And the Americans had brought factory-produced guns. Lots and lots of factory-produced guns. The M18 Hellcat perfectly embodied this American approach. It wasn't the best tank destroyer. The German Jagd Panther, when it worked, was arguably superior in firepower and protection. But the Americans built 2,507 Hellcats. Germany built fewer than 400 Jagd Panthers, and most of those broke down or ran out of fuel before they could engage the enemy. Quantity, Becker realized, had a quality all its own. After the war, Becker returned to his hometown of Dortmund to find it nearly 70% destroyed by Allied bombing. His family home was in rubble. His father had been killed in an air raid in 1944. His mother and sister had survived by moving to his aunt's farm outside the city. He reunited with them in June of 1945, a hollow-eyed veteran of a defeated army, trying to reconcile what he'd experienced with what he'd believed. Germany in the immediate post-war years was a landscape of ruins, both physical and psychological. The cities were destroyed, the economy had collapsed, food was scarce, and everywhere there was the reckoning with what the Nazi regime had actually been, what it had done, what crimes had been committed in Germany's name. Becker struggled with this. He'd been a soldier, not a party member. He'd fought on the Eastern Front and in France, but he'd never participated in, had barely even seen evidence of the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities. The revelations at the Nuremberg trials were shocking to many ordinary Germans who'd genuinely not known the full extent of the regime's crimes. Becker was among them. The war he'd fought, the war of tactics and tanks and survival, seemed suddenly small and irrelevant compared to the moral catastrophe his nation had perpetrated. But he'd learned something during those 3 days with the captured Hellcat, something that went beyond tank specifications and military doctrine. He'd learned that Germany's defeat had been inevitable, not because of any single battle or campaign, but because of fundamental assumptions about how modern warfare worked. Germany had approached World War II as if it were an extension of previous conflicts, where superior training, tactics, and equipment could overcome numerical disadvantages. The Wehrmacht had been, on a tactical level, often superior to its opponents. German soldiers were generally better trained. German officers were often more tactically flexible. German equipment, when it worked, was frequently more capable. But the Americans had understood something the Germans hadn't. Industrial warfare at the scale of World War II wasn't about individual superiority. It was about systems, about logistics, about the ability to produce, transport, maintain, and replace equipment faster than the enemy could destroy it. The Americans had built an entire military machine around the assumption that stuff would get destroyed and needed to be replaced quickly and cheaply. The Hellcat was the embodiment of this philosophy. It was cheap, around $55,000 per vehicle, compared to $83,000 for a Sherman. It was fast to produce. The Buick plant that built them could turn out one every 43 minutes at peak production. It was easy to maintain. The standardized components meant any mechanic with basic training could service it. And it was effective enough to do its job, even if it wasn't perfect. Germany had tried to build perfect tanks. America had built enough good enough tanks to bury the perfect ones under sheer numbers. Becker didn't speak much about the war for many years. Like many veterans, he preferred silence. He worked in reconstruction, helping rebuild Dortmund. He married in 1949, had 3 children, lived a quiet life, deliberately detached from military matters. Germany's rearmament in the 1950s, the creation of the Bundeswehr, the whole Cold War military build-up. He watched it from distance, interested but not involved. But in the 1970s, as historians began conducting more thorough research into the tactical details of World War II, several contacted Becker about his experiences. One researcher, a doctoral student studying the effectiveness of American tank destroyers, specifically asked about any encounters with the M18 Hellcat. Becker agreed to be interviewed. The conversation was recorded in 1978, when Becker was 61 years old. The transcript survived, archived in the German Federal Military Archive in Freiburg. The interviewer asked about German perceptions of American armor. Becker answered carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who'd spent decades thinking about these questions. "We were taught that armor was protection," Becker said, "that a tank's primary purpose was to shield its crew while delivering firepower. This made sense. This was logical. If you can't protect your soldiers, why put them in a tank at all? So we built thick armor. We built the Panther, the Tiger, eventually the King Tiger. Magnificent machines, engineering marvels." But the Americans asked a different question. They asked, what if the best protection is not being there when the enemy fires? What if speed is more valuable than armor? And they built the Hellcat to answer that question. The interviewer pressed, did Becker think the Hellcat was a better design than German tank destroyers? Better? Becker paused. No, not better in the sense of superior engineering. The Jagd Panther was a better vehicle on paper. More armor, better gun, more intimidating. But the Hellcat was more effective because there were so many of them, and because they could be everywhere. You can't fight what you can't catch. And you couldn't catch a Hellcat unless it wanted to be caught. I remember, Becker continued, we captured one in March of '45. Eastern side of the Rhine, in the forests. The crew had abandoned it, and we got it running. I took it up to speed on a road, and it did 90 kilometers per hour. 90, with a 76mm gun mounted on top. Our fastest tanks couldn't do half that. And I remember thinking, this is why we lost. Not because of this one vehicle, but because of what it represented. The Americans built weapons they could afford to lose. They built simple, fast, good enough equipment and made thousands of them. We built masterpieces and couldn't keep them running. The interviewer asked if this experience changed Becker's view of German military doctrine. "Entirely," Becker replied. "We were so proud of our Panthers and Tigers. We thought heavier meant better. We thought perfect engineering would win wars. But the Americans understood something we didn't. In modern war, the side that can shoot second is already dead. Doesn't matter how thick your armor is if the enemy hits you first and then disappears before you can return fire. That Hellcat, it shouldn't have worked. On paper, it was suicide. Thin armor, open turret, vulnerable to everything. But they built it anyway because they understood that speed changes everything. You can't shoot what you can't catch. You can't kill what's already gone." The interview continued for another hour, covering other aspects of Becker's wartime service. But he kept returning to the Hellcat, to those 3 days in March when he'd seen the future of armoured warfare and understood that Germany was fighting with the doctrines of the past. The M18 Hellcat's combat record supports Becker's assessment. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with Hellcats compiled impressive statistics. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, operating from July of 1944 through the end of the war, claimed 258 German armoured vehicle kills, including Panthers, Tigers, and tank destroyers, for the loss of 17 M18s. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion claimed 113 kills for the loss of 15 vehicles. These weren't inflated propaganda numbers. They were based on unit records, after-action reports, and physical vehicle inspections when possible. The ratios were real, and they were staggering. How did they achieve this? Speed and doctrine. Hellcat crews were trained to avoid direct engagements. They didn't hunt Panthers and Tigers head-on. They used their speed to reach flanking positions, to set up ambushes, to exploit terrain. They'd fire 2 or 3 shots. Standard doctrine was 3 rounds maximum, and then relocate before German forces could call in artillery or bring supporting weapons to bear. A typical Hellcat engagement went like this. Scouts spot German armor. Hellcat races to a hull-down position covering the enemy's expected route. As German tanks advance, the Hellcat's gunner aims for side or rear armor, which even the mighty Tiger couldn't adequately protect. Fire 3 shots. If you score hits, excellent. If not, you've certainly gotten their attention. Either way, you're already accelerating backwards down the reverse slope before the German crews even identify where the shots came from. By the time they can react, you're 500 meters away, setting up your next firing position. This was psychologically devastating for German crews. They were used to set-piece battles where you could see your enemy, engage them directly, and defeat them through superior equipment and training. The Hellcat denied them that battle. It imposed a different tempo, a different kind of combat where speed and surprise mattered more than armor and staying power. German after-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 frequently mention being engaged by fast-moving American tank destroyers that would fire and disappear before effective return fire was possible. The frustration is evident in the language. These weren't battles, they were ambushes. The Americans weren't fighting honorably, they were hunting. Of course, honorably is a meaningless concept when you're trying to win a war. The Americans were fighting intelligently. They'd assessed the strengths and weaknesses of German armor: excellent protection, powerful guns, good crews, but slow and fuel-hungry, and built a weapon specifically designed to exploit those weaknesses. The Hellcat was the answer to a question German doctrine had never considered. What if we simply don't let you fight the kind of battle you're good at? The M18 Hellcat was phased out of American service with remarkable speed after World War II ended. By 1947, most had been scrapped or sold to Allied nations. The US Army had decided that the tank destroyer concept itself was obsolete. Future wars would require heavier, more versatile vehicles. The lightweight, specialized Hellcat didn't fit into Cold War doctrine, which anticipated mechanized combat against Soviet armor in Central Europe. Some M18s went to other nations. China received some through military aid programs. Yugoslavia acquired a number. A few ended up in private collections. Most were simply cut up for scrap metal, their thin armour and aluminum components recycled into peacetime products. But the ideas the Hellcat embodied didn't disappear. The concept that mobility could substitute for protection, that speed was its own form of armour, that specialised vehicles optimised for specific roles could be more effective than generalised platforms, these ideas persisted and evolved. Modern tank destroyers and light armoured vehicles owe a conceptual debt to the M18. The Swedish S-tank, designed in the 1950s, took the hull-down concept to its logical extreme with an incredibly low profile and fixed gun. The Soviet PT-76 light tank sacrificed armour for amphibious capability and speed. American attack helicopters like the AH-64 Apache apply Hellcat doctrine in 3 dimensions: fast, agile, hit-and-run platforms that rely on speed and standoff range rather than armour. Even modern main battle tanks have incorporated elements of Hellcat philosophy. The Israeli Merkava, despite heavy armour, emphasises crew survivability and rapid battlefield mobility. The American M1 Abrams achieves high speeds through gas turbine engines, understanding that operational mobility getting to the battlefield first is as important as tactical protection. The fundamental question the Hellcat asked, how do we avoid being hit rather than how do we survive being hit, remains relevant in military design. Stealth aircraft apply the same philosophy. Don't armour the plane, make it invisible to radar. Modern naval vessels use speed and electronic warfare rather than thick steel plating. Infantry body armour balances protection with mobility, understanding that a soldier who can't move effectively is a target regardless of how much armour they wear. Becker's insight from March of 1945 that you can't shoot what you can't catch has been repeatedly validated across 7 decades of military development. Klaus Becker died in 1994 at the age of 77, having lived to see the reunification of Germany and the end of the Cold War. He'd outlived the Third Reich by nearly 5 decades, had watched Germany transform from ruins to economic powerhouse, had seen his children grow up in a democratic, peaceful nation that bore little resemblance to the one he'd fought for. In his final years, he occasionally spoke to students and researchers about his wartime experiences. He was careful, always, to contextualize. He'd been a soldier, not a Nazi. He'd fought for his country, not its ideology. He regretted much, particularly in retrospect, but he'd tried to be an honourable soldier in a dishonourable war. But when he talked about the Hellcat, his tone changed. There was something almost admirable in how he described that captured American tank destroyer. He respected the clarity of thought behind its design, the willingness to challenge assumptions, the courage to build something that conventional doctrine said shouldn't work. They were willing to be wrong about armour, Becker said in one of his last interviews, conducted in 1992. To say, everything we've assumed about tank protection might be incorrect. What if speed matters more? What if avoiding hits is better than absorbing hits? That takes intellectual courage. We never had that courage. We kept building heavier, slower tanks because that's what doctrine demanded. Even when it was obviously failing, we doubled down. The Hellcat was, I don't know how to say this in English, it was paradigm-breaking. It broke the paradigm. It said, here are new rules. And it worked because they had the industrial base and the tactical flexibility to make it work. We couldn't have built the Hellcat even if we'd wanted to. Not because we lacked the engineering skill, but because we lacked the entire system, the production capacity, the spare parts pipeline, the training infrastructure, the fuel supply that made it effective. War is a system, Becker concluded, not a collection of weapons. The Hellcat was part of a system. The Panther was a masterpiece standing alone. That's the difference. He died 6 months after that interview, peacefully, surrounded by family. Today, only a handful of M18 Hellcats survive. The American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts has one in running condition. The National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Moore, Georgia, has several, A few private collectors own restored examples. For a vehicle that was produced in the thousands and played a significant role in defeating Nazi Germany, surprisingly few remain. But the story of the Hellcat, the story of how speed defeated armor, how systemic thinking defeated individual excellence, how good enough in sufficient quantity defeated perfect in scarce numbers, that story endures. Klaus Becker's encounter with a captured Hellcat in March of 1945 was a small moment in a massive war. It involved no combat, no casualties, no dramatic last stands. Just a German tanker driving an American tank destroyer and realizing that everything he'd been taught was obsolete. Yet, in that small moment, the entire logic of Germany's defeat was compressed. The Wehrmacht had brought craftsmanship to an industrial fight. They'd brought precision to a war of mass. They'd brought quality to a contest of quantity. And they'd lose because, in the end, war is decided not by who has the best weapons, but by who can field enough good weapons for long enough to break the enemy's will and capacity to resist. The Hellcat raced down that forest road at 90 kilometers per hour, carrying a gun that could kill any German tank and armor that couldn't stop anything. It was absurd. It violated every principle of armored warfare, as the Germans understood it. And yet it worked. It worked brilliantly. It worked because the Americans had asked a different question and accepted a different answer. They'd built a weapon for the war they were actually fighting, not the war they wished they were fighting. 55 miles per hour with a 76mm gun, thin armor and an open turret, a death trap that killed its enemies before they could return fire. The Germans built Tigers and Panthers and marveled at their engineering excellence while they ran out of fuel and spare parts. The Americans built Shermans and Hellcats and overwhelmed their enemies with sheer numbers and operational tempo. One side asked, "How do we build the perfect tank?" The other asked, "How do we win the war?" The answer rolled through the forests of Germany at 90 kilometers per hour, too fast to catch and too numerous to stop, hunting panthers and tigers with the ruthless efficiency of industrial warfare. And when Klaus Becker stood beside that captured Hellcat in March of 1945, watching it accelerate away down that empty road, he understood with perfect clarity that the war was over, not because of this one vehicle, but because of what it represented. A nation with such overwhelming material superiority that it could afford to build weapons that prioritized speed over protection, that could afford to lose vehicles because they had hundreds more, could afford to think differently because they had the luxury of abundance. Germany had built masterpieces. America had built enough. And in war, enough always wins. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.